This is our ocean and our cryosphere, the frozen parts of the world. They shape our identities, our way of life. They sustain us and determine our future. But we are changing our planet in profound ways. Human-induced climate change is affecting the ocean and cryosphere and the way they support our lives, impacting our land use, industry, energy systems, urban areas, and infrastructure. In mountain regions, melting of glaciers and thaw are increasing hazards and threatening safe water supplies. Extreme events in coastal regions are becoming more severe. Melting glaciers and ice sheets are causing sea levels to rise. As our ocean absorbs heat and carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, sea temperatures are rising and water chemistry is changing, threatening the marine life we depend on. The IPCC Special Report on the Ocean and Cryosphere in a Changing Climate presents the latest knowledge and opportunities to address the challenges we face today and in the future. We are starting to adapt to unavoidable changes. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions further protects our livelihoods. Together, we can build a sustainable and equitable future for all. Our future is in our hands.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am David Balton. I am a senior fellow here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. I'm pleased to welcome you to the center, both those of you sitting in our audience and those of you watching online. For those who may be new to the Wilson Center, let me just say a word or two about our place. Congress charted the Wilson Center about 50 years ago as a formal living memorial to President Wilson. Our basic mission is to bridge the worlds of research, policy, and practice to inform more effective foreign policy. One of the reasons I came to the Wilson Center was because of its focus on polar issues. Indeed, the Polar Institute has landed here, and I'm proud to be part of it. The polar regions, of course, have received a great deal of attention in recent years, and indeed are a focus of our event today. And after arriving here at the Wilson Center, I learned that another subject near and dear to my heart, the ocean, resides in the very DNA of this place. Congress wrote into the charter of the Wilson Center a mandate to, and here I quote, increase understanding of the requirements for adequate international agreements for our rapidly expanding ocean environment, noting that scholars at the center can make important contributions in this area. This was 50 years ago. Today, the ocean is another focus of our event. So the Wilson Center, both our Polar Institute and our Environmental Change and Security Program, is pleased to co-host the event today with two terrific partners, the United Nations Foundation and Arctic 21. I wish to thank them for their stellar contributions. Special shout out to Monica Dean and Justin Kenny of the UN Foundation, and to Rafe Pomerantz of Arctic 21, from whom you will hear later. Last week, the International Panel on Climate Change issued the most recent of its special reports, this one on the ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate. For those of you who may not yet have had a chance to look at it, I strongly urge you to do so, at least the summary for policymakers. I found it very sobering, to say the least. And today, we will hear remarks from Co Barrett, Vice President of the IPCC, as well as from some of the authors of the special report. We will also hear from Norway's ambassador to the United States, Kari Aas, whose nation is a leader on issues affecting both polar regions and the ocean as a whole. But first, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Peter Ogden. Pete is Vice President for Energy, Climate, and the Environment at the UN Foundation. During the Obama administration, Pete served in the White House as Senior Director for Energy and Climate Change on the Domestic Policy Council, and Director for International Climate Change and Environmental Policy on the National Security Council. He also worked We actually worked together at the State Department, he as Chief of Staff for the Special Envoy for Climate Change. Pete.
Thanks very much, David. Good morning, everybody. It's always a big event whenever the IPCC releases a report, even more so when it is taking on a new topic in more depth than it ever has, as is in the case with this Ocean and Cryosphere report. But before we delve into the report here and you hear from the experts, I just wanted to say a couple words about why the IPCC's work is so unique and vital. And of course, there is the gargantuan amount of effort that goes into assembling these reports. There is nothing comparable in terms of scale, in terms of investment of time, and perhaps Co will say a few words about all that goes into this process. And it becomes the gold standard of climate assessment for the global community. But there's also another unique feature about these reports, which is that at the end, countries descend and negotiate what David just referred to as the summary for policymakers. The pen moves from the scientists and the experts directly into the hands of countries, and they have to negotiate what they believe is a succinct articulation of what policymakers take out of it. Now, you could disagree. You can read the 800 pages underlying and come to your own conclusions. Clearly, whenever in that transaction, you're seeing the science and the expertise begin to move into the realm of the public debate. And to me, that's actually one of the most important things about this report. One is that countries are forced to grapple with it. They have to, at the end of the day, face it directly. They can't ignore it. Secondarily, in that act of translation, they're beginning to put it into their own terms. And those are the terms from which the potential for more informed and better action can take place, which is really the ultimate service and the ultimate purpose of these endeavors, to hopefully inform better and smarter climate action so that we can learn from the scientists and the brightest experts available on this issue. At the UN Foundation, we've been partnering for a dozen years on each of the major report launches with the IPCC to help bring this its knowledge to the public. And I think the evidence from the last few reports has been that there's more demand than ever. I mean, you see that to some extent just in the amount of media coverage. It's also a greater just public awareness that this is an issue that we need to understand better and begin to grapple with, and the importance of science as a voice, as a place where we can come to get the facts is again, I think, increasingly valued by journalists and by the community at large. The other reason that I think that this is happening is because of events like this. And the events like this happen because the scientists and the vice chair of the IPCC come and don't take vacation after the launch of the IPCC report. Having done all of this work, their mission is done. They're not required to come and do these things, and yet they do. And I think for that, we all owe them a second and even deeper debt of gratitude beyond the work they've already put into this process. So thank you very much, and look forward to the rest of the panel.
Thanks very much, Pete. We are delighted to have Co Barrett with us this morning to give a keynote address. We were talking, Co and I, before the event. I think we last saw each other on a beach in Mauritius, but that's another story. As I noted, Co is vice chair of the IPCC, one of the first women ever elected to that post. She is also the deputy assistant administrator for research at NOAA. For more than 15 years, Co has represented the United States on delegations charged with negotiating climate agreements, including the scientific assessments undertaken by the IPCC. Co is widely recognized as an expert on climate policy, particularly on issues related to climate impacts and strategies to help society adapt to a changing world. Please welcome to the podium, Co Barrett.
Good morning, everyone. And thanks for such a nice introduction. I'm really happy to be here, in response to the invitation from all three prestigious organizations. Let me just test this to see if I'm going to be able to handle the technology. Hooray. Okay, so I'm speaking here today in my role as a vice chair of the IPCC, and I'm really honored to be here with several of the authors of the report who really have done the yeoman's work in carrying this through over many years. So here you have kind of the front and back cover of the report, which pays tribute to the various regions addressed in the assessment from the poles to the tropics. The ocean and the cryosphere, the frozen parts of our planet, might feel remote to some people, but they impact all of us for their role in weather and climate, food and water, for energy, trade, transport, for health and well-being, for culture and society. The ocean and cryosphere are critical for all life on Earth, as you will hear. While this report doesn't center on mitigation issues in depth, it has shown that if greenhouse gas emissions continue to increase, global warming will drastically alter these systems. However, if we reduce emissions sharply, consequences for people and their livelihoods will still be challenging, but they will be potentially more manageable for those who are most vulnerable. The report reveals the benefits of ambitious and effective adaptation for sustainable development. Conversely, there may be escalating costs associated with delayed action. So I think Pete did a great job of kind of talking in about the way that IPCC does its work. I find it to be unique in all the processes I've been involved with over the course of my career, because it is this very interesting, robust handshake between scientists and policymakers. So here's just kind of some of the numbers. 104 authors from around the world working on the report, 31% of whom are women, something we have spent a fair amount of time trying to increase the number. 36 countries, almost 7,000 studies, and over 30,000 comments from governments, experts, and just general citizens from around the world. So I find this report, of all the reports that I've ever been involved with, and this goes back to 2001 with the IPCC, to be unique because for the first time we've produced an in-depth report examining the furthest corners of the Earth, from the highest mountains and remote polar regions to the deepest oceans. And we have found that even, and especially in these places, human-caused climate change is evident. The report documents the melting of high mountain glaciers and polar ice sheets, which contain the fresh water for our future. It documents the thawing of permafrost, which is, quite frankly, the frozen foundation for communities and wildlife habitats of the North. It shines a light on coastal and low-lying areas where sea level rise and associated impacts threaten the lives and livelihoods of large segments of the population, and it documents the ways in which for decades the ocean has been acting like a sponge, absorbing carbon dioxide and heat to regulate the global temperature. But the report also shows that these systems can't keep up. Taken together, these changes show the world's ocean and cryosphere have been taking the heat for climate change for decades. The consequences for nature and humanity are sweeping and severe. The report highlights the urgency of timely, ambitious, coordinated, and enduring action. And what's at stake is the health of ecosystems, wildlife, and importantly, the world we leave our children. So now I'm going to spend a little time just going into the major segments of the report, and the panelists will certainly embellish more deeply some of these findings as we get into the conversation we all hope to have with you. So for high mountains, melting glaciers, snow, and ice in mountain regions are very visible symbols of climate change. A total of 670 million people live in high mountain regions, and they are increasingly exposed to hazards and changes in water availability. Glaciers, snow, ice, and permafrost are declining and will continue to do so, the report finds. Smaller glaciers found For example, in Europe, Eastern Africa, the tropical Andes, and Indonesia are projected to lose more than 80% of their current ice mass by 2100 if emissions continue to increase strongly. As glaciers retreat and snow cover shrinks, warm adapted plant and animal species migrate upslope. This changes species richness. Cold and snow adapted species decrease and risk eventual extinction, especially without conservation. A sobering finding. The retreat of the high mountain cryosphere will continue to adversely affect recreational activities, tourism, and cultural assets. What is more, the retreat of glaciers and thawing permafrost increase hazards for people living in those regions, for example, through landslides, snow avalanches, and floods. And changes in water availability for households, agriculture, and energy will not just affect people in these high mountain regions, but also the communities much further downstream. So now I'm going to move to our findings for polar regions, where these changes influence people's life around the world, wherever they live, and I'll demonstrate that. So the report finds that the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets are losing mass. In fact, these ice sheets are now the key drivers of sea level rise, in addition to the expansion of the warming water. But because ice sheets will continue to melt in response to past and current warming, the planet will experience global sea level rise for decades and centuries to come. Arctic sea ice is declining in every month of the year, and it's getting thinner. Permafrost, frozen soil and rock, is thawing, and the potential of adding more greenhouse gases to the atmosphere is rising. Even if global warming is limited to well below 2 degrees, around one quarter of the near-surface permafrost will thaw by 2100. If greenhouse gas emissions continue to increase strongly, around 70% of near-surface permafrost could be lost. People living in the Arctic, especially indigenous peoples, are already adjusting their travel and hunting activities to the seasonality and safety of land, ice, and snow conditions. But their success in adapting depends on funding, capacities, and institutional support. I saw this firsthand when I visited Alaska 2 weeks ago and had the chance to talk with some folks in native villages who were just sharing their stories about how life is changing for them. So just for knowledge, 4 million people live permanently in the Arctic region. Moving on to sea level rise, small island developing states are home to 65 million people. These small island nations have been very vocal in their concerns about the effects of sea level rise. And they are very vulnerable to sea level rise and coastal extreme events. The report finds that during the 20th century, the global mean sea level rose by about 15 centimeters. It's currently rising more than twice as fast. And the pace will further accelerate, reaching over 1 meter in 2100 if emissions are not sharply reduced. Sea level rise will increase the frequency of extreme sea level events, which occur, for example, during high tides and intense storms. Many low-lying coastal cities and small islands will be exposed to risks of flooding and land loss annually by 2050. Without major investment in adaptation, they would be exposed to escalating flood risks. So what can communities and cities at the coast do to adapt? The scientific literature addresses various adaptation approaches, including building protections, accommodation, ecosystem-based adaptation, coastal advance, and, in cases where it is required, managed relocation. The report has an entire chapter on oceans and marine life, and it finds that marine life is already affected by warming and changes in ocean chemistry, which impacts the people that depend on this important resource. Changes in the ocean to date, the ocean has absorbed 90% of the heat in the climate system. It will take up 2 to 4 times more heat than between 1970 and the present by 2100 if global warming is limited to 2 degrees, and up to 5 to 7 times more at higher emission levels. Marine heat waves have doubled in frequency since 1982 and are increasing in intensity. They are projected to further increase in frequency, duration, extent, and intensity. Changes are especially harming warm water corals, kelp forests, and the distribution of marine life. By absorbing human-induced carbon emissions, the ocean is becoming more acidic. This is already making it harder for some marine species to build their shells and skeletons. The ocean has taken up between 20 to 30% of these carbon dioxide emissions, and continued uptake will exacerbate ocean acidification by 2100. An ocean that is warmer, acidifying, and is losing oxygen has implications, severe implications for marine life, its distribution, and productivity. And changes in the ocean cause shifts in the distribution of fish populations. This has reduced the global catch potential. In the future, some regions, notably tropical oceans, will see further decreases, but there will be increases in others, such as further north in the Arctic. Communities that depend highly on seafood may face risks to nutritional safe health and food security. So what we will see is that human-induced climate change has a major footprint on the systems that we depend on, from the top of the mountains to the depths of the ocean. And these changes will continue for generations to come. This new report highlights the urgency of prioritizing timely, ambitious, and coordinated action to address widespread and enduring changes in the ocean and cryosphere. It provides, as all of our reports do, the best available scientific knowledge to empower people, communities, and governments to tackle the unprecedented transitions in all aspects of society, including energy, land, and ecosystems, urban and infrastructure, as well as industry, that would be needed to deliver on climate commitments, including those in the Paris Agreement. The report gives evidence of the benefits of combining scientific and local and indigenous knowledge to develop suitable options to manage climate change risks and enhance resilience. And this is the first IPCC report that highlights the importance of education to enhance climate change, ocean, and cryosphere literacy. I'll just end with this quote: "The more decisively and earlier we act, the more able we will be to address unavoidable changes, manage risks, improve our lives, and achieve sustainability for ecosystems and people around the world, today and in the future." Thanks for your attention.
Thanks so much, Co. Our program next features an exceptional group of people who participated in authoring this special report on the oceans and cryosphere. I'm also so pleased that Monica Medina, former colleague and friend, will serve as moderator for this panel. Monica is the founder and publisher of Our Daily Planet, an environmental email newsletter. She is also an independent consultant and an adjunct professor in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Previously, Monica has also had senior positions with the Walton Family Foundation and the National Geographic Society. She has also had a stellar career in government, serving with distinction in both the Department of Defense and NOAA. Monica, the floor is yours.
So I don't have too much to add because I think the panel is going to tell us so much that we want to know. I just wanted to note that I read a lot of morning newsletters, and I found an interesting fact in the New York Times newsletter this morning, which noted that climate science actually dates back to 1856, when the first demonstration of the impact of carbon in the atmosphere and its warming effect came to be known. A woman named Eunice Foote did an experiment at a AAAS meeting in 1856. So, golly, if we can't figure this out now, we don't have another 150 years. So with that, I'd like to just say thank you to the organizers for letting me help run this panel, and I want to bring the panelists up on stage now and introduce them. First, Dr. Robert Kanto, who's a professor of geosciences at UMass Amherst. He previously held positions at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, NCAR, and at NOAA, and he's one of the lead authors of the study on, in particular, the polar region section of the report, and he has recently led fieldwork in Antarctica. And I guess let me read out their names, and then they can come on up. Next, Dr. Mark Eakin, who is a coordinator of NOAA's Coral Watch program. He specializes in using NOAA satellites to monitor environmental conditions that lead to coral bleaching, and particularly using those satellites to warn of upcoming coral bleaching events. And finally, Dr. Michael Oppenheimer, who is a longtime IPCC participant. He shared in the 2007 Nobel Prize for the work in the previous reports. He's currently the Albert J. Milbank Professor of Geosciences and International Affairs at the Wilson School in Princeton, at Princeton University, and is the coordinating lead author on the report's sea level rise section. So why don't I invite them up, and we'll let them do presentations quickly, and then we'll get started with a conversation. So I don't know if there was an order in particular. Dr. Eakin, would you like to start? Sure. That would be great.
And I'm going to do something a little different in mine. Let's see, slides are coming up. Rather than sticking strictly to the report, these reports are things that come together through time. Scientists contribute to them. I was one of the contributing authors on Chapter 6 on extremes. But then it stops. And the editing process goes on. But the climate impacts continue. So what I'm going to do is bring some of what we've been seeing to light into today, because this is going on right now. So what you'll find in a less animated version, assuming, there the animation goes. In a less animated version in the SROC is the information on the increase in marine heat waves, and in particular a major bleaching event that we had. The Chapter 6 on extremes has an image of what happened in 2015 and 2016. This is showing the entirety of the most recent global bleaching event. We've had 3 global coral bleaching events now, one in 1998, one in 2010, and this one that started in mid-2014 and extended for 3 years until May 2017, bouncing back and forth between the northern and southern hemispheres, like a very diabolical tennis match. This is the biggest event we've ever seen, and this was captured in the report. But what's even scarier is the fact that this is still going on. It's not the same event. We had a little bit of a reprieve, but right now we're looking, and this is from the data that I pulled up yesterday from our website, showing the heat stress around Hawaii and the central North Pacific, as well as in the Caribbean. Right now, there's a risk of bleaching in both of these areas. This is from our satellite data. The next image comes from our climate model work, where we use climate models to forecast out 4 months in advance. And you can see that really dark area sitting right over the top of Hawaii. Hawaii in 2015 had its worst coral bleaching event ever, and now we're looking at something that may be even worse just in 2019. And again, in the Caribbean, which has been hit multiple times, we're looking at the potential of severe bleaching, and that's going on right now. To zoom in, and I'm afraid the slides came out a little darker than they should, but you can see the cloud of threat hanging over Hawaii right now, showing the extent of coral bleaching threat. And the darker the red, the bigger the threat. That's the simple way to explain these diagrams. This is a diagram showing, based on the latest reports this week, of the bleaching observations that have already come in the state of Hawaii. So you're looking at the reports as of this weekend. Across all of the main islands of Hawaii, and in addition, not on this, the Marine National Monument, the Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, has severe bleaching going on right now in multiple locations. If we zoom in on what this looks like for the future, the upper left is what you're looking at right now. You saw that a moment ago. The forecast model for weeks 1 through 4, in other words, the next month, continuing to have high stress in Hawaii. Even moving into November, we are looking at the potential of high heat stress going on in Hawaii before it finally moves out. This is now. This isn't just what's in a report. So in the special report on oceans, cryospheres, and a changing climate, it talked about the marine heat waves and the rising temperatures that are causing bleaching, disease, and death of corals around the world. In that, it talks about the 2014 to 2017 event that was the worst bleaching ever. But now we're looking at severe bleaching expectations in Hawaii and in parts of the Caribbean. It really underlines that the problem of climate change is getting worse. Bleaching, along with these marine heat waves that affect so many other ecosystems, as Co mentioned a minute ago, are increasing in frequency and intensity, and it's getting worse. We have hope. I can't give up on coral reefs yet. You know, what else am I going to do? These are magnificent ecosystems. We've got to do everything we can. But the time for climate action is now.
Thank you, Mark. Next, how about if Dr. DeCanto, you tell us about your part of the report.
Thank you, Monica. So you can't read the words on this figure, but this is the take-home figure from the summary for policymakers. And so you'll be able to go to the SROC website and look at this figure, study it. What you can see, not needing to see what the numbers are, is that there are blue lines with a blue shading around them, and there's a dark red line with red shading around that. So these are our projections of these different components of the climate system in terms of how they are going to evolve in future decades and centuries. And the blue curve is an aggressive mitigation in emissions. So it's sort of along the lines of the aspirations of the Paris Climate Agreement versus a high emissions case. And what this report did was look at the low end, a much reduced fossil fuel emission future versus an extreme look at what might happen if we were to go full steam ahead with a fossil fuel-based economy. So I really was providing a supporting role for the work that you're going to see from Michael Oppenheimer in a few minutes. I study the ice sheets. And as Co pointed out, something is new in terms of sea level science. So over the 20th century, sea level was rising, and as Co noted, it rose about, something like this, about 15 centimeters from 1900 to 2000. Most of that sea level rise was caused by the heat that's going into the ocean that Co also talked about. So warm water with more heat in it, the water expands, takes up more room, makes sea levels rise. In the turn of the last century, so early 2000s, there's been a switch. What's dominating sea level rise now is land ice, the glaciers melting, eventually running through rivers to the ocean, and the big ice sheets, Greenland and Antarctica. So the climate over Greenland, it's in the Arctic. I'm sure you all know that the Arctic is warming faster than the rest of the world, roughly at twice the pace. So Greenland is feeling warmer and warmer summers, and it's melting from the top down. It's just surface runoff, just like a warm, sunny day after a big snowstorm here in D.C. The snow and the ice doesn't last very long. And as it's melting, the ice is actually getting darker. And as it melts, the surface of the ice sheet lowers, and because it's lowering, it's going into lower levels of the atmosphere where it's warmer. So there are positive feedbacks that can make that melt accelerate. So we've been worried about Greenland for a long time because there's more than 7 meters of potential sea level rise locked up in the Greenland ice sheet. Okay, Antarctica had, up until this report, the thinking had been that it is still so cold down there that the ice sheet isn't feeling those warm air temperatures. We don't expect anything really bad to happen on sort of decadal to century timescales. And that's one area where this report is different from previous IPCC reports, in that we now are aware that Antarctica is beginning to wake up, and it is a sleeping giant. It has roughly 8 times more potential sea level rise locked up in the ice on Antarctica than Greenland. So even a really small fraction of change in Antarctica could have really monumental implications for sea level. And I'm going to show you just one slide that where this report diverges from previous IPCC reports in our thinking about Antarctica. So, okay, I keep, being asked, okay, so we hear the headline statements as Co just nicely rattled through, and you can see them when you read the bullets in the summary for policymakers, and it sounds really bleak and grim. Okay, and so I'm constantly being asked, what can I take home from this that's positive? And it's this diagram. And again, not looking at the numbers, you see the blue curves and you see the red curves going into the future. And you see that in every instance, whether we're talking about ice sheet loss on Greenland, ice sheet loss on Antarctica, whether it's acidification of the oceans, the blue and the red curve are really different. There is going to be change. Sea level rise is one area where sea level is going to continue to rise. We're going to be facing more and more impacts around the world that we're going to need to adapt for. But it's a very, very different story if we follow the high emissions trajectory versus the low. And so to me, when I see a red curve versus a blue curve like this is sea level rise going out into the future, projected to the year 2300, a longer-term view. The world following the blue emissions trajectory, very, very different than a future in the red. And this is the role, ultimately, between blue and red of policy. So there's a lot in this report that makes us realize, okay, stuff is happening now. It's urgent. We need to get on this. But there's still a lot of room for a much, much easier, I think, future if we start to mitigate in the short term. And I'll just, did I just turn it off? And I think there are 2 slides we're just going to look at for a moment each. I broke it. Okay, great. So this is from the main report. So we have the summary for policymakers. It's roughly 40 pages. I think it's 41 pages long. And as someone mentioned, there's more than 800 pages of background material you can look at. So these are our new projections of sea level rise moving into the future that compare the SROC report to previous IPCC reports, mainly the 5th assessment report published in 2013. Oops. The emissions pathway on the left is that highly mitigated case, again, sort of following a Paris Agreement sort of aspiration for future energy transition and a low-carbon future versus an extreme on the right. And you can see that the SROC report essentially sits right on top of the previous IPCC reports until we go out to the extreme case in terms of emissions, the diagram on the right. So the likely range, so where we're confident that there's less than a 17% chance that sea level rise would be higher or lower than that red range, over a meter now, a 10% bump since the last IPCC report. And where that's coming from is this realization that Antarctica could be a really key player in the future that we don't want, again, to wake up. And the reason for that is this. So this, I'm going to end on this slide. And, this is what I do. This is what I study, how this ice sheet behaves. Why Antarctica is so special and why we're really worried about it is that this is what the edge of a lot of the Antarctic ice sheet looks like. And it might look a little funny to you because this is sea level. And this is the bedrock that the ice sheet sits on. The edges of a lot of the Antarctic ice sheet, as huge as it is sitting on bedrock in places more than 2 kilometers below sea level. So it is in direct contact with the ocean. And we're putting heat into the ocean. And the ice sheet is beginning to feel that. It is beginning to melt from the bottom side. So this is the grounded ice sheet that is actually so thick that it's sitting on the bedrock, and the ice is flowing from left to right out into the ocean. And as it's flowing out into the ocean, it's starting to thin. And as it thins, it starts to float. The ice sheet starts to float. And those floating extensions are called ice shelves. Those ice shelves are really important because if they bump into something, they actually slow the flow of the ice from the ice sheet out into the ocean. And those ice shelves around Antarctica are thinning. And as they thin, they don't offer that nice resistance to the flow. And the ice sheet is beginning in many places to flow faster out into the ocean. If it gets warm enough in Antarctica, the ocean can be melting these ice shelves from the bottom up. And it could get warm enough in these high emissions cases that we actually start to see the ice sheet in Antarctica starting to look like the Greenland ice sheet, where we see meltwater, ponds of water on the tops of these ice shelves, and that water can get into crevasses and cracks and help break up these ice shelves even faster. So this is the sort of state-of-the-art science. This piece has really evolved in the last 10 years and is evolving from year to year. The next IPCC report regarding Antarctica is going to probably look even different. But this is the source of that sort of step change in our thinking about what future sea level could look like. If it stays cold enough and we keep heat out of the ocean and it never gets warm enough to have those melt ponds on the ice shelves, then the projections for future sea level rise are much less. But as you're going to hear next, even with the sea level rise that's happening today, measured in millimeters per year, it doesn't sound like much. By 2050, as Michael Oppenheimer will tell you, that is going to have impact. What we don't want to see is sea level rise rates measured in centimeters per year, which is what these high-end emission scenarios suggest could happen if Antarctica starts to be a player in the next century. Thank you.
Last but not least, we'll hear from Dr. Michael Oppenheimer.
So I'm going to pick up where Rob just left off and talk about, so what do human beings, individuals, societies do about this problem? Just let me emphasize a couple of things that he already said. Let's see. Where did the helper go? Who actually, there we go. All right, so let's go back. I want to go back to that. Yeah. Go back to the slide that, the slide with all the, yep, stop. So if you look in the lower left-hand right-hand corner, there are a few things I wanted to bring out in that slide. One is that sea level in the red curve is just basically accelerating as it is now. It continues accelerating at a faster and faster pace throughout the whole period you see there, which is the next 300 years. While the blue curve reaches a kind of, doesn't quite stabilize, there's still a little bit of acceleration, but it starts to look like it's approaching some limit. And the difference between those curves is basically, if you think about it, that's what we face is human beings trying to adjust to a future where the future is running away from them continually, and a future where it slows down enough so we have a chance to catch up. Or I should say almost anything in between. We don't know where we're going to land. The closest we get to the blue curve, the softer the landing will be. In the red curve, we may never land. The sea may just keep accelerating essentially forever. The other thing you should notice is that the two curves don't separate much at 2050. And the uncertainties are not big, therefore. And therefore, policy has a nice near-term target to think about. Governments have something to think about. They can't just claim that the uncertainties are so large we can't do anything about it. And by the way, I want to say, I'm going to make a lot of comments, which are my comments on what governments do and do not do. Those are my views, my interpretation. IPCC never tells governments what to do. I have no such compunctions. Not that they listen. So one of the things you can't see from this slide, we never developed a great slide to show it, is that one of the effects, as Rob alluded to, is that very soon, in fact in many places already, the frequency of extreme events, those are for instance very high tides or storms that cause surge, both types of events push the sea inland to places it doesn't ordinarily arrive at. That's what flooding is about. And the level or the height of the flooding depends not just on the height of the surge, which is a property of the storm, or the height of the tides, which is a property of the astronomical cycle, largely, not entirely. But it also depends on sea level rise. What sea level does is it pushes the whole thing up. If it's 1 meter, it pushes the whole thing 1 meter higher. That's approximately what happens. And by 2050, sea level heights by the coast, or interpretable to a certain extent as flood heights, that occur now, once a century, will occur due to this height transformation once a year, annually, at many places. By 2100, those returns will happen annually at basically most places around the globe where we have enough data to do an analysis. So the east coast of the United States, much of the west coast, many other places, certainly by 2100, and many places by 2050 will be facing the current 100-year flood if they do nothing to protect themselves additionally annually. That puts a very, very high premium on adaptation. And as I said, adaptation is going to be a lot easier if from there on out we're following the blue curve than the red curve. So there are 4 ways that we studied in this report of adapting. You can retreat from the coast, and people are already doing that. In the wake of Hurricane Sandy, there were buyouts. The government, state and federal government went in and bought property away, returning some of it to natural buffer like marshland. In other cases, they let people come in who had enough money to buy the land back and build houses that were taller and more flood resistant than the ones that is up on stilts, so more flood resistant than the ones they currently own. We can accommodate like that. We can stay in place but raise our habitation, our infrastructure, et cetera, like ports. The military has some concern about this. We can protect. In certain areas, it pays, like densely populated areas, to build seawalls. Hard stuff, concrete and steel. That's a very good solution if you have enough money, which many places don't, for the densely populated area. But people who aren't in the core of this, actually areas around it may actually suffer in some cases from, for instance, wave action reflecting from the protection and then going eroding areas that are further away from the densely populated areas. And finally, some countries, like the Netherlands, over time have advanced into the sea as a form of protection. They built that country from a below sea level situation, more or less, into the ocean, raised a lot of the areas, then built protection out further. That's something which will probably be done in some places. But a precondition for all of this, an absolute precondition, is that we cut emissions. There is almost no place on Earth that we have looked at carefully where, based on current performance, we can say that it's likely that the protection would be able to keep up with the accelerating curve. There are many places where, given we know the capacities are and what the capacities could be in the future, that protection could keep up with the blue curve. So, and then what we worry about the most is that although humans are ingenious, although it's possible in some technological sense to keep building protection, keep raising buildings, keep accommodating in various ways, keep retreating in certain places, not so much the low-lying island states of the Pacific, of course. You have to have a place where people can go, and they don't. We know that there are barriers to this happening, that nothing happens perfectly, nothing happens close to perfectly in this world. So, for instance, and here I'm going to be critical of the situation in the United States, it's a very good example of having a great capacity and not doing it right. From my personal point of view, the National Flood Insurance Program is a disaster. It's bankrupt. These stories about homeowners being paid repeatedly to rebuild. Part of this is because they want to rebuild. Part of that is because if they have insurance, the rates are sub-market. There was an attempt to fix that in the Congress in 2012, which was quickly repealed. So they went halfway, not even halfway, towards market rate insurance. And then think about it, if you're a mayor of a city, the federal government gives nothing except after a disaster. It's supposed to give money for building resilience in advance, but it never has in any significant degree. So if you try to build resilience in advance to these 100-year events happening every year in 2050, the federal government isn't going to help you, and you have to raise local taxes. That's a problem for politicians. You're never going to get credit for the protection because big storms don't strike all that frequently. You're probably out of office before then. But if you wait, even the best intended politician, if that person waits and there's a disaster, they know the federal government can come in and they can look great because they can stand on a pile of rubble and say they got the money to fix all this up. And then the rebuilding will happen. That's cynical, but it's the state of affairs. And if you layer on top of that the fact that individuals forget about disasters unless it disrupts their personal life within a year, the political will to really fix the system simply isn't there. So that's all I'll say for now. We can discuss more later. I will say that if we manage to up our game, the U.S. has a better than a fighting chance, but it all depends on cutting emissions rapidly and globally in the first place. Thank you.
So I just want to start out by saying those were incredible presentations, and I was lucky enough to get to hear them last week, too. You've been making the rounds. And I wanted to set some context for these folks who probably haven't gotten to study your work yet. So it seems as if the IPCC has been working on a series of products over the last couple of years. And the latest one came out in August, just before this, on land. And Oceans is the last one, I believe, of these specialty reports. And then you'll go back to doing another large assessment again. So my question for you, maybe, Co, is how is it that Oceans got included this time, and why did it take so long?
I can definitely address the first part. The second part, I'll attempt to. So I guess back in 2015, we solicited some proposals from governments that, what they would like us to take up in our special reports. And the way that we manage the cycle of assessments in the IPCC is that we do a couple of special reports at the beginning of a new cycle. And then we jump into our main assessment reports, which are kind of our showcase products. I will say we've never done 3 special reports like we did here, and I think we never will again, because it really stresses the working groups and the authors. I think, Michael, you're actually on the special report, 2 special reports, right? And
yeah,
2 special reports, and also maybe.
But no, not in this cycle. 1 in this cycle.
Okay. Anyway, it's a real undertaking to do a special report. And also to do the main assessment reports. So we solicited proposals from governments. We got 55 different proposals. And we just kind of winnowed those out, and we had a rather contentious negotiation in Nairobi in 2016 to decide on the 3 that we were undertaking. So we did the one that was requested of us by the Framework Convention, that is what would happen with 1.5 degrees of warming. We settled on one that is basically all things land, and we undertook this one on Ocean and Cryosphere. And there were a number of governments that supported us doing this because, quite frankly, we haven't given attention to these important areas of the world before in this depth. We've done it in pieces of our main assessment report. And I think it really reflects a growing understanding of the importance of these regions as you consider climate. And we'll be going into the next Conference of the Parties for the Framework Convention in Chile in December. I think they will have a strong focus on oceans, which is an important issue for them, but also cryosphere and other issues that are reflected in this report.
Anyone else want to add? I just want to say thank you, because as someone who's been working in oceans for a long time, it was really gratifying to get this wrap up, this incredible summation of all of the stuff that we read about, in study by study as they come out, but to see it all in one place, to have it gathered together, to have the world's experts like you all making, this report a reality really is quite gratifying. So thank you from all of us who've been working on oceans for a long time. To see all this come to fruition is great. And I don't know if anyone else has any other comments.
I'll just comment that one of the importances of this report is that the governments around the world, particularly at the local level, but also at the national level, are actually making decisions daily about what to do or what to pass on and let be done later on the coast. And one of the key messages in this report is if you're making decisions about the coast today or anything, any construction, infrastructure, settlement, anything along the coast, you have to take this into account.
So hold that thought. I have a question for you in a minute. But I want to start by asking everyone kind of a warm-up question, which is, what was a revelation to you in coming together and creating this report? What did you learn? What did you find that was really surprising that hadn't really struck you before because of the collaboration and that interaction and the exchange of ideas?
I guess I'll start just to give you guys some time to think. So I'll just be honest that putting the ocean and cryosphere together in one report was a political expediency. We had to kind of figure out how we distilled 55 ideas into 3 reports. So it felt a little bit like a mishmash, but as we went through our consideration of the information, we actually saw that we had kind of happened upon a storyline that was incredibly compelling about the flow of water from the very tops of the highest mountains and polar regions to the bottom of the ocean, and all the communities that depended on that. And I actually found that to be a useful way to link these issues for the average person, but it also kind of gave real relevance to water as the lifeblood of this planet, as we talk about it in the report.
It's interesting that as we've moved through the reports, there has been this increase in the focus on the oceans. And in fact, in the 5th assessment report, the last full assessment report, much more substantial work, a chapter on the oceans that hadn't existed previously. And then the inclusion of that in the 1.5 degree report and now the special report on the oceans. At the same time that this was going on, one of the things that was becoming quite apparent in the scientific community and a realization is we've been talking about heat waves on land for a long time, but the concept of heat waves in the ocean was something that just wasn't there. So that just in the last few years has been identified a way of categorizing that and determining how you consider and quantify heat waves, marine heat waves, has come to the fore just in time for this report. And so this was one thing that was, of course, highlighted in the extremes section, but came out in other sections, especially the one on ocean life, how much impact we're having. And we're seeing this all over. We have movements of fisheries going on. We have loss of kelp ecosystems. Of course, we work in coral reefs. We've been seeing that for a long time. But these changes and the impact of these marine heat waves is something that has been growing. And the other part that the that was apparent in the special report is the forecasting, the look forward, not the forecast, but the scenario development of what it's going to look like in the future at 2.5, at 8.5, the various levels of potential heating that the models, the scenario models represent. And at all of those levels, what you're seeing is this increase in these marine heat wave events and the impact it's going to have down the line.
So I'll make one quick comment, and both Co and Michael could provide better historical perspective on this. I was particularly proud to be part of this cycle of reports because these reports, each chapter is integrating the physical science with social science, with people who do policy, people who study governance. So the standard IPCC assessment report, if you go back to the previous report, the AR5, you'll see 3 volumes, one on the physical science basis, one on adaptation, and one on mitigation. And here we were integrated. We were at lead author meetings in small rooms for weeks at a time, the scientists with the social scientists. And, after 2 years, we really did begin to learn each other's language. I think it was very enriching, and I would hope that the IPCC actually continues along these lines. I think this is where the big advances are going to come.
Yeah, first of all, you're right on. I have a long experience with IPCC, and although we've tried many times before, I think it's got a long way to go, but it really reached a high point in the context of this report. And in that vein, what I learned the most had to do with the governance and what governments do or do not do. And on a more positive spin, there are places around the world where you can find examples of intelligent management of the coast. No place does it perfectly, but there are examples of different places doing the right thing. And this is a case where we're going to have to, within our own specialness, each country is going to have to learn from what's being done in other countries. And the other part of that is even the countries that do the best job you can identify are going to be challenged by what you see over here.
Okay. I think very interesting to hear about each of your perspectives, and the idea that you integrated policymakers into the discussions was evident from both reading the policymaker summary, but then just seeing how you approached the problems. So question for you, Mark. You talked a little bit about these heat waves, and I found that to be a really striking phrase because it all of a sudden made it really obvious to anyone who lives above the the sea on land what a heat wave feels like and what that means. But I was curious if you could drill down, beyond coral reefs and El Niños, which people have talked about. What does that really mean? What kinds of other impacts would we see because of that? You started to talk about fisheries and the like.
Well, let's just pick up on another case of what was in the report, which was this feature off the west coast of the U.S. called the blob that existed in 2013 to 2015-ish period and had dramatic impacts. It wiped out fisheries for quite some time. There were fisheries that were completely closed because of problems of toxic compounds in the fish. There were sea mammals, sea lions and seals dying. There were fish dying. There were birds dying. Crab fisheries just collapsed for the period that was in place. These were big. This was a big event. The blob is back. So this is one of these things that we're now realizing. When you look at the marine heat waves, they actually start in the level of days, but it's really these big events that last for the matter of weeks to months to years. We have a number of these spots, and there was a wonderful article in the Washington Post a couple of weeks ago about what's been going on with the yellow clam fishery off Uruguay. And again, it's just the same thing where this is a fishery that had grown up and is now almost non-existent. It's, very few people can even make a living in that fishery. And these are changes that have been occurring. There used to be major lobster fisheries in New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts. You know, we refer to New England lobster. Well, most of the New England lobster are coming from Maine or Canada because the fishery has moved up the coast. And this is what we're seeing, is this continual advancement, the expansion, more frequent marine heat waves as they're moving up the coast, and the forecast, the scenarios all show that we're going to be seeing that in the future. And the question to us is, how far do we want it to go? How bad do we want it to get?
So I'm going to direct this one to Michael because it follows absolutely from what you just said, Mark, and I appreciate that you may have a harder time answering this question. But last week at a hearing, the day after your report came out, the head of the fisheries service in our U.S. government claimed not to know that there was a connection between climate change and fisheries movements, and that perhaps there was a connection with severe storms, but he wasn't sure because he's not a meteorologist. So just wonder what you say to that, Michael, as you think about what we need to do in terms of fisheries management, the kinds of changes we need to start making, and perhaps using better data, electronic monitoring and reporting, those kinds of things. How do you see us getting ahead of these problems?
I hardly know where to begin with respect to this administration's treatment and attitude towards science. It's abysmal, it's tragic, and a lot of time is being lost as a result. That isn't to say that everybody who works for the federal government is, painfully ignorant in some way. That isn't the case. Many people are doing a terrific job. I personally have some of my ex-students who work in the federal government, and I tell them to stay because they're needed. And but at the higher level, if you ask the question of what influence does science and facts have on decision making, well, I think you can answer the question for yourself. So what does that say about what we need? Well, there's a big gap on any front, whether it's enough tide gauges to measure sea level, whether it's making sure the satellite systems that measure sea level and a bunch of other things stay in place, whether it's the monitoring in terms of biodiversity and wildlife. All of these systems need, we built terrific observational systems, but they weren't enough as is. And some of them are decaying now because of basically the overlap between political proclivity of the current administration and the continuing pressures on the budget. And scientists, my colleagues, are very worried about particular parts of that system falling apart and not being replaced in a timely fashion, if at all. And it's hard to make the case with the general public about this. It's less important to them than a lot of other things. But it isn't just special interest pleading in this case. We're poking our eyes out, basically, so we won't see what direction we're going in.
So that's a great segue to another question I had. I've actually been thinking a little bit about this recently. I helped contribute to a book that's coming out soon, and I wrote a chapter not because I'm a meteorologist, but because of the need for what I see as greater predictive capabilities in terms of climate. So picking up where you left off, Michael, and thinking about, Mark, what you've done with coral bleaching forecasting, talk to me about what more we could do given what we know. If we had more observations, how could we make those forecasts, or those prediction seems a little strong, but those assessments going forward, how could we make those more robust, and how could that help society adapt?
Well, certainly the whole area of eco-forecasting or ecological forecasting is one that's been in development and has sort of been occurring in fits and starts. But we have a great capacity. There are a number of places where we know what's going on with the biology sufficiently that we can make these kinds of predictions. In our own work, we're going to be, or we're in the process of developing some new tools for forecasting coral disease in addition to coral bleaching. And there are other things along those lines. But by pulling together the experts who have the basic knowledge in the biology and ecology of the systems we're talking about, and the abilities we have both from an observational perspective, and from a forecasting perspective in terms of the models. There are a number of areas, especially a number of fisheries now, that have been developing some very nice systems for forecasting out and getting a better idea of what's going on. Going back to the lobster fishery, there have been systems that have been developed to look at potentials of how the next season is going to be that helps guide decision making on the fisheries, the investments of where the personnel would need to be. This is done all the time using satellite data for fisheries, large fisheries at sea, where the large ships are going out and targeting the areas where they're going to be the most productive. So there's a great deal of ability there, and that, of course, can also then be taken and has been moved into the climate change scenarios, looking at decades in the future, what changes are going on, and there's some great work being done on things that are referred to as climate velocities, or the rate at which species are moving poleward in most cases, but moving from their current ecosystems to other ecosystems, and the impacts that that's going to have on fishing communities, on fishers who may have to go farther, may have to move, set up new base of operation, and on policymakers who are making decisions because they may suddenly have a fishery that never existed in their waters. And so it does bring in whole new areas, and the ability to do that sort of forecasting and tie that from the physical science all the way to the policymakers is someplace we really need to be looking at, because those changes are happening.
Robert, I don't want you to feel left out. So I was going to ask you a similar sort of question about whether or not this is so bad, because at the Arctic Council meeting last, I guess over the winter, a certain high-level U.S. government official said that, well, the melting Arctic is great. We're going to have lots of great new development and activity in the Arctic as a result. And I just wondered, how you all approached the assessment that you're making in terms of sort of the potential benefits and the way some people may look at that. Is that something that you thought about as you looked at the scenarios, and then in these rooms with policymakers trying to figure out, okay, what to do with this? Do you think that that warming and the melting that will occur in the polar regions could be good? Just ask the hard question.
Wow. So because I was mostly focused on sea level rise, you'd be hard pressed to think about a positive outcome from sea level rise. I'm sure in terms of an open Arctic, and you think about trade and trade routes opening, that will ultimately be, I suppose, perhaps in the short term beneficial to some, but overall it's hearkening a really dramatic planetary change that is only going to accelerate and exacerbate the changes that we're talking about. When the Arctic Ocean is free of sea ice, when you've seen the famous blue marble photographs of the Earth, the ocean looks black. It's a really good absorber of sunlight. So when the Arctic in the summertime doesn't have any sea ice anymore, even more heat is going to be going into the Arctic Ocean, having all kinds of long-term impacts. Canada, you'd think, might have a lot to gain. Canada, actually, they have a different sea level rise problem in places where they have the potential to have deep water ports in the Arctic basin. Sea level is actually not rising, it's going down, because that part of the world is still recovering from the big ice sheet that used to sit over that part of Canada. Pretty interesting. So, Canada might actually not have so much to gain in terms of trade opening. And then, of course, the ice sheets. If the Arctic Ocean is ice-free, Greenland's going to be melting faster, causing an even greater rate of increase in the rate of sea level rise. And again, so one thing that I think is a really strong argument, again, for mitigation with sea level is that with the ice sheets, they're not going to grow back in maybe even a human species sort of, time frame. It's essentially a permanent commitment to a certain amount of sea level rise. Like the Antarctic ice sheet I showed you that is bathed in ocean water, if the oceans warm up, the ice sheet won't be able to recover and push its nose back out into the ocean to make sea level come down again. And with Greenland, sort of the same thing. As Greenland melts and becomes lower, it's now in a warmer atmosphere, it's not going to come back. So slowing down the rate of that ice loss and ultimately, hopefully, stabilizing that sea level rise is going to be really critical, because, again, it's not like if someday we have the technology to scrub CO2 out of the atmosphere, it's not like everything's going to go back to the way it was at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution overnight.
Monica, can I add to
Yep,
that?
absolutely.
So when I was in Alaska 2 weeks ago, I happened to be in Nome when 2 cruise ships came into port within a 24-hour period. They had both started in Greenland and worked across Arctic and came into Nome, which is by no means a town that is prepared to handle cruise ships, I can say. Every school bus was employed to kind of move them off their ships and to demonstrations of various things. And I did get a chance to talk to some of the folks who were on those ships, and they showed me pictures on their cell phone of polar bears on ice and all these wondrous things that you can only see in the wildest places of the North. And yet, this report kind of demonstrates that exactly what they're looking to find as they go north is in real grave danger. And I think there is an existential crisis about how do we treat these very wildest places where explorers have gone for centuries. They kind of hold our imagination, or in their case, kind of our pictures that they'll share with their children when they get home. So the trade-offs for me then were really, really apparent.
Thank you. Well, I could ask questions forever, and I've been lucky to get to do that. But I think we have time for audience questions now. And so there's a microphone in the room. If anyone has one, please raise your hand. And I think maybe come around. There's more on this side. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see you over there, the lights. How about the fellow in the white shirt? Yeah. And then we'll just kind of go back.
Thank you, John Wilson. Hi, Go.
Hey, John.
There was a lot of discussion about the changes in deep circulation patterns in the ocean, and the effects of that. I haven't read the report, but I'm wondering whether those are something that you looked at, and whether we can expect some real significant changes, and we haven't thrown the switches yet. So, curious about that.
So the story in this report on what's called the meridional overturning circulation, or the thermohaline circulation of the Atlantic, hasn't really changed since the 5th assessment report, where what the bottom line was, by the way, if you don't know, this circulation moves heat and salt around the Earth, and it's part of the reason, not the whole reason, why Northwest Europe has a relatively moderate climate compared to climate at the same latitude in the Western Hemisphere. The story is the expectation this will gradually slow down, but not have any radical effect on the climate during this century. There's an argument, there's uncertainty, let me put it that way, about what will happen thereafter. The fear is that the circulation will eventually collapse in a warmer world, as it has collapsed in a colder world in the past, in the distant past, and that could have could cause radical oscillatory behavior in at least parts of the climate system. But the story is it's not an immediate threat. I wanted to mention one other thing, which is perhaps more of concern, although it's very hard to nail down the uncertainties, but it gets a fair amount of attention in the report. And it goes to this question about leaving the Arctic alone. What's wrong if the Arctic unfreezes? There's the issue of the release of carbon, either as carbon dioxide or methane, from permafrost as it melts. And no one really has a good handle on how fast that could go. There's a big storage of carbon, which, if it all wound up in the atmosphere, would be a big positive feedback on the climate problem.
Okay, so many questions. Gosh, it's hard to pick. How about the woman in the blue jacket? Yes. Back a row. There we go.
Thank you all for being here. My question is a little bit of a divergence, but it's about this rhetoric in the past probably 5-ish years about the link between climate change and homeland security and national security. I wanted to hear sort of your thoughts on what that, it's almost a creative way of linking two things, and whether the threat is, or how severe that threat is, or if you see it more as a, for lack of a better word, creative or politically expedient way of mobilizing action.
When are you talking?
Yeah. We're all looking at Sherry sitting in the front row.
I don't know whether you guys have an immediate answer, but I feel like we're jumping ahead a little bit. Sherry, do you want to the person who invented the phrase
I feel the thunder from this great panel, because I have learned from each of you, not only today, but in the past, but as someone who's worked with military and national security leaders, for well over a decade on climate change as a threat multiplier. The evidence is all here. We're going to talk more about it in our next panel, and there's a lot more that we could say about how these changes described here in the oceans and cryosphere and sea level rising, et cetera, are exacerbating the threat multiplier of impact of climate change in various regions of the world.
Okay, let's go to this side of the room. There's someone in the back. Yes, you.
Hi, thanks again for being here. I have a question, and I'll admit this is probably coral inspired, but not necessarily coral specific. I know that the focus is really on sea level rise, but I know Mark mentioned a little bit conservation side of things. So I guess my question is, what do you think, is that just a stopgap measure? Is there benefits for conservation? And I'm thinking coral-wise, things like, putting out genetically engineered heat-resistant corals, that kind of sort of radical conservation level stuff.
Well, in fact, the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine just issued a pair of reports, a special study on coral resilience and looking at some of these more radical approaches that could be taken. And I think what we're seeing in coral reefs right now really parallels the discussions going on in many other ecosystems. And so it makes for a good analogy. And that is, there are all kinds of things that can be done for local conservation. There are things we can look at to improve the future. We're far from genetically engineering corals. Right now, the work is good old-fashioned crossbreeding and testing and trying to breed supercorals. And that's great, because that, for a few species, is going to get us a bit more time. But that's all it does, is buy us a bit more time. We can only do so much in the case of corals and most species in terms of trying to accelerate evolution to a warmer world. We have to be taking the effort to change things, to slow us down. All of those diagrams, the blue curves versus the red curves, the closer we can be to the blue curve, the better, because no matter how much we take conservation action on the local scale, if we don't deal with climate change, it's really game over for most coral ecosystems and a lot of ecosystems around the world.
Go ahead.
Yeah, let me add to that, corals are probably the worst case because of the combination of high heat sensitivity and also acidification. But other ecosystems have a better chance if we would just create some room for them. The biggest problem with, for instance, salt marshes isn't climate change, because they can keep up with a fairly fast rate of sea level rise. It's all the other stuff we do along the coast, digging stuff up, filling, et cetera, building on top of marshes. And we forget that marshes are a natural defense, and the importance, and this is a big element in this report, the importance of ecosystem-based defense is becoming understood much better. We still don't know much about the economics of it, but we know in certain situations it's particularly if it's a complement to other approaches, it will help a lot. And in the meantime, we're trashing the coast. It's basically an insane approach to coastal management at this point.
Okay, We have time for probably one or two more. The woman in the blue dress, yes. Or black, is it black? I'm sorry, yes. I'm so bad at picking.
Thank you.
people.
I'm actually
Right.
colorblind. My name is Anita Parlow, and I worked with the Harvard MIT Arctic Fisheries Project, a Wilson program. And I was a Fulbright in Iceland, and I recently have been working on projects in Alaska, both with the Denali Commission on Shishmaref, Nutak, the villages falling into the sea, with the Tanana chiefs who are moving from some people moving from a non-cash to a cash economy in reindeer herding because they can't subsistence game fish for the next generation probably, and with the Port of Nome. I just finished, and may I be very clear that I'm speaking for myself, not for anybody else at all. So my question was one that was brought up. I'd be very, very interested in this because it's really brought my mind to a quizzical stop point, is there are people who are very much in the middle of climate change every single second. I was also just back from Savunga last week. I was 10 days in Savunga. And so people in Savunga, they hunt, they fish, they whale, they collect berries in the mountains. And when I asked them the questions, they said, well, you know, for the last 2,000 years, we've been doing this. We go where it is. And we have a collective memory that goes back to the first two ice ages. And so that's how we deal. And then with the Port of Nome, and again, I'm speaking on behalf of myself, my observations is they don't want to be bypassed. There's a lot of ships going back and forth between China and Russia, going up the Bering and going across at some point slower, the Northwest Passage, and there'll be a Central Arctic Ocean, which by mid-century it looks like a couple of boats will be going back and forth for a month or so, and they're right there. And so how is it that, and oh, by the way, on the Denali issue, slow-moving catastrophe is not part of FEMA's mandate, and so how do we engage with the folks who are right there on the front lines? They don't particularly view it as being on the front lines. They're just living, and they're dealing with what's in front of them. And it's kind of like taking the macro levels and taking the micro levels. And what lessons do we have to learn from the folks who are on the front lines? And also, what do we have to share with them to support their efforts? Thank you very much. And your remarks are incredible. Thank you.
So I can say one thing to that might sound encouraging to you. So there are a lot of people who have woken up to this issue in the Arctic. And the National Science Foundation, so the U.S. National Science Foundation, solicited public opinions about what we really need to work on over the next decade or so. They have these 10 big ideas, and navigating the new Arctic is one of them. So the National Science Foundation is investing in this and getting physical scientists together with people who are studying the cultural loss that's happening and these other things that happen in a rapidly changing climate, and particularly to people that are so vulnerable, like the ones that you just mentioned. So I think that's good and encouraging.
Well, I'm afraid our time has come to an end. I want to say thank you to the Wilson Center, to David, to Rafe for organizing this wonderful panel, and thank you and congratulations to the authors of the report who were here with us today to talk about their incredible work. Please join me in giving them a round of applause.